I mean, I was actually thinking about this the other day. Even I, like at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, like having written The Unpersuadables, which is all about irrational beliefs, I was predicting that the COVID pandemic would just wipe out the anti-vax movement, because there's that phrase that there's no such thing as an atheist in the foxhole. You know, everyone's dying around you. Of course, that's going to, bust through these crazy stories that people tell. But actually, if anything, it's got stronger. It's extraordinary. Just a couple of days ago, we had anti-vaxxers making siege to the BBC Television Centre, which hilariously is no longer the BBC Television. It's now flats, it's apartments. They didn't realise they went to the old BBC Television Centre and tried to storm their way in. I mean, it's just madness. And so it really does show the extraordinary power of irrationality that in this global pandemic that's killed millions and has touched probably every life. Everyone knows somebody that's suffered badly from COVID. It's still not enough to break through these sort of incredibly powerful stories that people tell themselves.
Here in Los Angeles, we had anti-vax protests outside of a cancer clinic not far from where I live. And I went through cancer about 6 years ago, and I couldn't imagine anything worse than going through that experience, having to go to a clinic for your chemotherapy or whatever, and then getting confronted by these idiots standing outside and having to walk past them, and the lack of empathy. And I do think this is because you write about anti-vaxxers in the Status Game, but can you give me a big picture overview from what you learned from The Unpersuadables in terms of why people go so far into these fringe or extremist beliefs, such as the anti-vaccination during the time of a pandemic?
Yeah, sure. So when you were talking about your experiences, back then, you talked about the the lack of empathy that the anti-vaxxers showed. But I think that's the point. I think to them, they're showing to their minds, they're showing extreme empathy because they're heroes. Actually, it's you that's wrong, and they're trying to save lives. So it's not that they are cartoon villains loving destruction and death and torture and pain. They actually think they're the heroes, and sincerely. And the book I wrote before The Unpersuadables was about, it was sort of in my 20s, about ghosts and ghost hunters. And the big takeaway from that for me was that people who believe in ghosts, they really believe in ghosts, and people who are spiritualists and mediums, they really believe it. They're not these idiot frauds who are just in it for money and attention. They sincerely believe it. And I think what happens is that we sort of massively underestimate the power of the brain to kind of seduce people with its stories, and that's the big takeaway for me. It's that we've evolved not to be natural seekers of truth, but natural kind of believers of stories. And there's no more convincing story than the story of our own heroism. And if we hit upon a set of beliefs that make us feel heroic, make us feel kind of special and important, and we kind of attach our identity to that belief, then it becomes extremely powerful. And the mind has this kind of battery of ways of defending those kinds of beliefs from reasonable doubt.
Interestingly, in the Status Game, you write about how societies such as Japan and China see status as the responsibility of the group, which is much different than individualist nations. And we can talk briefly about Selfie, which was the book that we first met after you wrote Selfie, how we became so self-obsessed in what it's doing to us. And that very much, I think, is a nice companion to the Status Game. So when you're talking about the hero of your story, there is such an emphasis on me or I being the hero, not the collective society. So Rolling, what parallels were you able to draw between this thrust toward individualism from The Unpersuadables into writing Selfie?
Yeah, the cultural thing is really interesting. But I think the important thing to know about that is that it's not a categorical difference, individualist kind of Westernism versus communitarian kind of East Asian kind of Confucianist culture. It's more a matter of kind of emphasis. So we're all naturally groupish, by default. It's just that there's a stronger emphasis on the groupishness in East Asian cultures. Anti-vax is a group. And when somebody plugs themselves into that group, they're going to absorb absorb that group's beliefs and other things too, the way they dress, what they read, how they think, how they talk. Humans are amazing kind of copying creatures, and we're programmed to kind of join groups to seek connection with like-minded people. And then once we've joined those groups, most people aren't happy to be on the bottom rungs of any group. Nobody wants to be the least important member of a group. We have this kind of will to rise, the will to gain status within that group. And, those are very sound evolutionary reasons. All living things are driven to kind of solve the problems of survival and reproduction. And for humans, this groupish kind of humanitarian species, the more status that we get, the better our chances for survival and reproduction. The more resources we get, the safer our sleeping sites, the better choices of better choice mates. So that's the basic heuristic in the human brain. Just get status. If you get status, everything else gets better. So that's what we do. We join groups and we try and get status. And in a group like the anti-vax groups, these kind of irrational groups, the way you gain status is by defending and proselytizing their sacred beliefs. So in the status game, I interviewed a young woman from Pennsylvania called Miranda Dinder, who just told me a fascinating story about her kind of tumble into anti-vax craziness. She was 18, a single mother, isolated socially, really, because all her friends were at college and she wasn't. And she wanted a home birth, so she found a midwife that would do that. And the midwife came around and just had the usual run of questions. And then at the end said, "Have you ever considered not getting your child vaccinated?" And she was like, "What are you talking about? What? I don't understand what you mean. I've never heard of such a thing." So she just said, "Oh, look on Google." So Miranda went to Google and typed in "why not vaccinate," and was confronted with this entire kind of world of reasons why not vaccinate. And then she hit upon this Facebook group, and she said that was the big one for me. And she announced herself as vaccine hesitant, and she was kind of instantly surrounded by people telling her all these stories about, I had this kid who became autistic. I had this kid who, it was a disaster, and so she was brought into this group. But what she said was that she immediately felt that she was surrounded by these amazing, impressive mums, and she just thought, I want to be like these people. These are really brave mothers who just are out there fighting for the health of their kids, and how amazing. And so, she just thought, I want to be like them. And she said, the more you went out into the world and proselytized for your beliefs, the more you embraced those beliefs and fully actively believed them, the higher you would rise in that status game of the Facebook anti-vax group. So you see that's very common in all kinds of these kinds of groups. It's common in cults. It's common in religions. This idea that in order to gain status, you have to be the kind of puppet and warrior for the sacred beliefs of the